Welcome back to the Diet Doctor Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brett Scher. Today I'm joined by Ty Beal. Now, Ty got his PhD from UC Davis in geography with an emphasis on global nutrition. And he's a research advisor at GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, where his focus is on sustainable food systems, dietary quality, and nutrient adequacy. And he's pretty active on Twitter at Ty Beal, Tyrbeal. And one of the things I really like about Ty is his focus is on nutrition adequacy, dietary adequacy, because we hear so much about plants are good, animals are bad, or animals are good, or plants are bad, or whatever the case may be, right? These polarizing messages. Whereas Ty says, well, what does the evidence say about the nutrient adequacy? And he doesn't just focus on the US, where he's based, or the industrialized countries, but he's also focused on a global initiative to make sure that nutrient adequacy is the same for everybody, or at least improving for everybody. Because what might be a recommended diet in one place may not be nearly as good or even feasible in a completely different world. And that's, I think, a problem that we have. Look, I mean, there's no secret that there's a big push for plant-based or plant-exclusive diets here in the US and in industrialized worlds. And I think that's very problematic, not just here, but imagine what the message would be in areas where they don't have access to whole foods the same way that we do. And even if when we have access, there's still going to be a significant risk of nutrient inadequacy. So that's a big part of Ty's message that I really appreciate. So I hope you enjoy this conversation and his take on what it really means to have a nutrient adequate diet and what the messages we're hearing, how that may or may not help with that. So enjoy this interview with Ty Beal. Ty Beal, thanks so much for joining me today on the Diet Doctor Podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks for the invite, Brett.
Yeah, I first came across you when there was all this discussion on Twitter about the food compass, which I definitely want to get to. But I was so interested as I learned more about you and your work and your focus on sort of nutrient deficiencies. And I think it's important to sort of clear up this concept of nutrient deficiencies, because there's sort of an easy stereotype to say, oh, that's, emerging countries, third world countries, low income countries, but it doesn't really apply to westernized and industrialized countries. And through your work, I learned that's definitely not the case. So I'd like you to take a moment to just sort of clear up what nutrient deficiency means and how it's similar or different between different countries.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. When most people think of inadequacies in the diet or undernutrition or nutrient deficiencies, they think of primarily low and middle income countries, in Africa and South Asia. But what we have found from recent work assessing the adequacy of diets as well as the prevalence of deficiency is that it's actually very common also in high income context. Now, it's not as prevalent, it's not as severe, but it certainly contributes to ill health. And so, as an example, in the US, deficiency is actually relatively common among women and children where we have data. So an example of this is in women 15 to 49 years. In the US, it's about 22% who are deficient. And even in the UK, it's about 21%. Zinc deficiency is about 14% in the US among women, and about 10% in the UK. Also in the UK, you see other deficiencies like folate and vitamin D, close to 20%. So something that we think, this isn't really an issue in high-income countries. You don't have to worry about it, especially for certain groups like young children, women, pregnant, lactating women. You really do need to pay attention.
Yeah, I mean, 20%, that's 1 in 5 women are going to have, in that age group, have a nutrient deficiencies, which is kind of shocking. Now, with the dietary structure so different, the access to food so different, what do you think the main difference is for the reasons for nutrient deficiency in industrialized countries like the US and the UK versus Africa and Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I think that's important to understand. And really, the difference in the access to nutritious foods varies widely. So in the US and other high-income countries, you generally you have a lot more access to diverse diet, fruits and vegetables, animal source foods, etc. In low-income context, it's really quite different. You see diets dominated by a single staple. So, for example, rice in many Asian countries or corn in many countries in Africa. And really, the diet doesn't provide anywhere close to enough nutrients because, in large part, they don't have access to diverse foods. They're unaffordable. They can't access them. So I think the cause is really, in the high income countries, we really see ultra processed foods dominating the food supply, and so those foods are also nutrient poor, right? So countries that have a lot of access to, wealthier countries that have access to ultra processed foods, that could be a contributor to the inadequacies we see.
Yeah, it seems so unfair to the third world countries, or like you're talking about the low income countries. They just don't have access. But here we've got plenty of access. We're just making the wrong choices. We're just making bad choices. It's almost like, it's not. You could say it's not their fault. It's our fault, which is not the right way to put it, because we've been sort of hijacked, I guess you could say, by these ultra processed foods. But let's take a next step though and say, okay, so nutrient deficiencies. Well, what does that really mean for practical terms? Because it's easy to say, okay, you're low in iron or you're low in zinc, but what does that mean? What are the implications for people?
Yeah, first I just want to say, I think personal choice plays a big factor in the poor dietary, poor diets in high income countries, but a lot of it is, structural. There's a kind
Yes.
of there's a lot of our food environment that makes it tough, and it's convenient. Foods are addicting. So I don't want to put all of it. I think it's sort of a balance of that, like individual choice and the system, right? And the access
Right.
and
I
sort
didn't
of
mean
what
to
people are
imply
exposed
that
to.
it was personal choice. I meant to say it seems like it's that way because of the difference, but really, you're absolutely right. It's the structure of the food environment that we've been sort of thrust into, and this evolutionary and environmental mismatch. So yeah, I think that's a very good
Yeah,
point. Yeah. All
exactly.
right.
And so, but yeah, when we think about the consequences, what does a nutrient deficiency mean? It can mean different things to different people.
Right.
A mild deficiency in a nutrient, may not show any actual physical symptoms. It may have some slight impact on somebody's health, but it's not going to be a major issue. But when you see severe deficiencies in iron and zinc, vitamin A, iodine, etc., you actually have consequences especially for young children during the rapid growth and development, really stunting their growth, hindering development of cognition and the brain development. You see reduced scores on tests and school
Right.
performance, and really there's this cycle of malnutrition that perpetuates when you have undernourished mothers who are giving birth to children. They're already starting off kind of at a disadvantage, and so you really see that cycle. Consequences can range from blindness for vitamin A deficiency, goiter for iodine deficiency. So there's numerous consequences, but they can have severe effects, and they can even increase risk of infections and death.
Yeah. So it seems, I mean, you don't want to have deficiency in any age group, but it seems the deficiencies are so much more impactful for the young age group, for the infants, the kids, even the teenagers during their growth phase. Because if you sort of miss out on those phases of life, it's not like you can catch up later, right? Like if you have deficiencies at that time, and don't grow and develop properly, those can be permanent effects, can't they?
Absolutely, and that's why it's so important to really ensure adequate nutrition in early life.
Yeah. And so, since there's a difference in sort of the etiology of the malnutrition, in industrialized countries, it's the ultra processed foods dominating, even though we have other choices. But in the lower income countries, it's just they don't have the options. So there might not be just one solution, but the solution that we hear so often for a better diet, better planet, et cetera, is a more plant exclusive diet, which seems at odds with combating the nutrient deficiency, because one of the papers you published showed that the most nutrient dense foods are mostly animal foods. And you went through the list: the organ meats, the bivalves, the crustaceans, the fish, the goat, the eggs, the beef, and then the dark leafy greens, and then other veggies, and then milk, yogurt, and cheese. So it's predominantly the animal foods that give you the most nutrients the most efficiently, but yet the push for less animal products in our food system seems like it could potentially worsen nutrient deficiency. So is that a concern of yours as well?
Yeah, it's certainly a concern. I think it should not be sort of seeking to minimize animal source foods as much as possible, which is sort of the narrative you often see in the U.S. And really, to me, it's about having, animal source foods, but really adding plant-rich foods to the diet, not ultra-processed foods, kind of
Hmm.
replacing those foods. What really concerns me is this sort of push to apply our health issues in the US or in other high-income countries into low and middle income countries, where animal source foods, we know people are consuming very small amounts infrequently, and they can benefit the most from increases in animal source foods. So I get concerned when there's this sort of push to, we just need to go all plants, or we need to go reduce animal source foods as much as possible. I think that really could have important harmful consequences to really not address the undernutrition that we see. And this is impacting people's lives, right? So it's not just us in the West saying, yeah, we all just need to go vegan. We have access to all these foods. It has bigger
Right.
implications than that. And which we really see is that deficiencies are not negligible in the U.S. They're not negligible in the UK or in high income countries. So I think we really need to pay attention to nutrient adequacy, as well as this push to reduce chronic disease risk, which should include plant rich foods, right? But it's sort of a balance.
Right, right. And what is the message that New York school children are now learning? It's been in the news a lot lately that New York is now going vegan Fridays for their school lunches. So one, again, you mentioned the replacement foods. Chances are they're not getting quinoa and beans and Brussels sprouts and asparagus. And soy and lentils as their vegan meal. They're going to get some tater tots and some vegan pizza and some chips or something. And it's the replacement food isn't there. But what are they learning? They're learning the message that animal foods are bad.
Right.
And as they're kids, and we talked about the importance of nutrient deficiencies for kids, they're not necessarily learning that the ultra processed foods are bad. So, you've been sort of vocal about that. What is your reaction when you see something like that the mayor of New York City is instituting this vegan Fridays at school lunches?
Yeah, I think it's misguided, and I think the issue is not that the health implications of this one meal, which is, taking up a very small amount of the overall diet. It's the message that's being sent. I think you had it right on the money. We're sort of putting this message out here. Animal source foods are bad, and they're unhealthy, they're unsustainable, they're unethical. I think that's a bad message to send. I think we really want to say, look, we want to have balanced diets. We should have, a range of animal source foods and plant source foods. The beauty is that the combination really helps to ensure nutrient adequacy. They have complementary nutrient profiles. They have different roles. We should not be demonizing animal source foods, in my opinion. We should be trying to improve diet quality. So I would be totally happy with a policy that says, we're going to have Whole Foods Friday, or we're going to cut out some of the junk food on Friday, right? And a lot of that would be plant based. It could have some, ultra processed meats that are cut out too. So that I think would be a positive benefit, and it would send a message that I think is the key factor, which is let's try to go towards more wholesome diets. Let's get away from the ultra processed foods when possible.
Yeah, that worries me so much. The message that kids are hearing, because when they hear it from their teachers or where they hear it from their government officials, whatever the case may be, people who are in authority to them, they're going to believe it a lot of the times when they're kids, and they're going to think that's the quote unquote right thing. But when it's reductionist thinking, which you've criticized before, nutritional reductionism, then it doesn't educate people in the right way. So tell us what you've meant. You've been critical about reductionist thinking. Tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah, I think being overly reductionist is often this term called nutritionism. It's saying, like, we can reduce whatever it is. Let's say it's nutrition. We can reduce nutrition to a few individual components in the food. So it's these essential vitamins. It's protein or whatnot. And really, I think when you go that route, one of the interesting things is we can see nutrition. You look at two foods from a sort of nutritional profile. You can compare foods on a piece of paper that look the same. They're not going to impact the body the same. So I think the Kevin Hall's study on ultra processed foods in 2019, the randomized controlled trial, they tried to really match for some of these factors. They matched for fiber, they matched for protein, they matched for energy density. Yet those on the ultra processed diet compared to those on the unprocessed diet consumed 500 more calories per day in a free feeding scenario, and they gained a bunch of weight. So
Yeah.
it's not just about the nutrients. It's not just about what you can see on a nutrition facts panel. It's about the level of processing. How palatable is that food? How likely are you going to overeat it? How does it impact your microbiome? What's the food matrix? Like all of those. I think that all matters.
Yeah, that's a great point because some people have said, well, if we're going to keep eating these ultra processed foods, why don't we just add protein and fiber to them to help? But with Kevin Hall's study, that doesn't look like that's going to make a bit of difference because something about the ultra processing is what stimulates the people to overeat over 500 calories per day. I mean, that was pretty dramatic in that study. Um, so it is interesting then. So it's not just about protein. It's not just about carbs. And so you've said we shouldn't be talking about protein. We should be talking about protein containing foods. So again, tell us the difference between those.
Yeah. So oftentimes you see this sort of you see terms that are laid out. Animal protein, plant protein, and they're often presented as if they're interchangeable or their value is sort of just from their protein content. For starters, the bioavailability of protein varies. Essential amino acids different varies between these foods, but also the nutrient density varies. Micronutrients like iron and zinc are in highly bioavailable forms in animal source foods. So when you kind of reduce foods to these single nutrient, an animal, it's an animal protein or it's a plant protein, I don't think you lose a lot of the nuance and you lose a lot of the factors. Other things like cofactors and nutrients that can influence absorption. It's not just about the nutrients. It's really about the package of nutrients. It's about the food matrix that holds those nutrients together and how your body can process those nutrients.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. Food is so much more than just the macronutrient that happens to predominate in it. So now, would you say though that you can't meet a nutritionally adequate diet without animal source foods? Would you say that's a true or false statement?
I should say that's a mostly true statement if you don't have access to supplements and fortification. So the big
Right.
one being B12. Now, I think if you're on a vegan diet, if you have access to all the right foods, you have a diversity of plant foods, and you are paying attention to your nutrients, you certainly can have a nutrient adequate diet. But it takes a lot of intention, right? It takes a lot of access. You have to have access to these things. You have to have access to a doctor to check your iron status, for example. So I think it's the lower what we see in our research is the lower the animal source foods in the diet in terms of the average population, the higher the risk of inadequacy. Just because they're really certain nutrients that are hard to get through plants. So iron, zinc, B12, vitamin D.
Yeah. So here in the US, for anybody who's middle to upper income and can shop at Whole Foods or shop at, a good grocery store that has a supplement aisle and that has a variety of different foods, probably no problem to meet all your nutrition needs to get nutrition adequacy. But someone who is in one of these food deserts, which are so prevalent in the United States, where your food's coming from the local convenience store or from the fast food joint or whatever the case may be, very different story then to get nutritional adequacy. And even then to take the leap to say, okay, now let's go back to Africa and Southeast Asia where you've done so much of your work. Probably 100% impossible to have a nutritionally adequate diet without animal source foods. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say that's largely true. There's already very low consumption of animal source foods. If you have this message from the West saying we need to heavily restrict animal source foods, it's going to be hard to try to really address the problems. This is poor child growth. It's stunting. It's nutrient deficiencies that are impacting people's lives. And I think the message needs to be we need to balance the diet. So we need animal source foods. They need to be in the right context. We need to have a lot of wholesome plant foods. But I think that message is overly simplistic, and it actually has some potential harms that can result.
Yeah. As you know, you just published a paper with Frederick Leroy and others about the role of animal source foods and the role they can play in a healthy environment. That is not all about this reductionist thinking, animals are bad for the environment, but they actually can play a role. So tell us more about that, what you found in that paper.
Yeah, so we were invited to write this. I should say Frederick was invited to write this paper, and he invited me and others to really review the evidence and to present ultimately sort of an argument that says, look, we need to address issues around health sustainability and ethics. And when we think about animal source foods, those issues matter. But the solution is not to either completely eliminate animal agriculture or to drastically reduce it. It's to produce produce animal source foods in a way that is has a positive or minimal impact on the environment, that is humanely raised livestock. And so we try to we don't try to be very prescriptive about we need to do exactly this, or you should consume this exact amount or not, but we try to really push back against some of the narratives, global narratives, that have said, look, everybody should be going completely plant-based. Animal source foods are harmful to health, they're harmful to the environment, and they're unethical. That type of message is not really balanced, in my opinion. And so what I think we're doing is we're saying, look, not everybody has to eat animal source foods. It's fine if people choose to be vegan, if they have that choice and they have access. But we also shouldn't go and say everybody should reduce their consumption of animal source foods. And especially as we look at the malnutrition problems in other countries. I think one of the stats what we found in our analysis of nutrient deficiencies, I mentioned the prevalence in the US and UK. 1 in 3 women, 15 to 49, have at least one deficiency in the US. 1 in 2 have a deficiency in the UK. But this number is incredibly high in some countries. So in India and some other countries in Africa, 9 out of 10 adolescent girls, 15 to 19, have at least one micronutrient deficiency. And many of them have multiple micronutrient deficiencies. So this is not a small issue, and especially in sort of the developing world, and it's important to consider that.
Yeah, so is that just not common enough knowledge? Like, if the people who produced, Eat Lancet, or the people who are behind the push for a plant predominant diet, are they just not aware of I know you can't speak for them, but what's your guess? Like, are they just not aware of these micronutrient deficiencies?
I think that many people probably aren't aware of them, or to the severity of how common they are, or of the impact that they're having. I think if you work primarily in high income country context, you probably aren't very aware of it. Most of my colleagues are, and a lot of the authors on the Eat Lancet are. I work with some of them, and I think they care greatly. I think ultimately a lot of this evidence is sort of the reason we have wrote this paper that's it's actually going through CDC clearance right now, but the global analysis on micronutrient deficiencies, is because we haven't had good data on this. The last estimate globally was from over 30 years ago, and it was just based on anemia. It didn't include any biomarkers of actual micronutrients. So that's one of the reasons we conducted this study, and I think it'll be really helpful to show, just for advocacy purposes, just say, look, diets are inadequate in many different contexts, and in some contexts is just so highly inadequate that it's having a real health burden. It's a significant public health burden. In the Eat Lancet diet, another paper we have under review is looking at the adequacy, and I think it all depends on how you look at adequacy. Do you properly account for the bioavailability of iron and zinc in the assessments? I don't think that was really done properly in that analysis. So when we account for that, when you account for the amount of phytate, which is an anti-nutrient, it hinders the absorption of iron, of zinc, you actually have to consume more iron than you would if you have more animal source foods and less phytate. So what we found is sort of, on that diet, you do see some inadequacies for zinc, for iron, calcium, and B12. The big one, which I think is sort of underappreciated, is that women 15 to 49 years, the Eat Lancet diet provides, from our analysis, about 55% of the recommended intakes. So it's just over half of the recommended intakes. That's not going to be an adequate diet. So regardless of your perspective, let's say that your view is that for sustainability reasons, for ethical reasons, we need to minimize animal source foods. We have to have an alternative approach. It can't just be eat this diet that has, is low in animal source foods and be fine. We have to say, we're going to have to strengthen fortification policies. We're going to have to try to improve access to supplementation. And it's not easy. You look at, one of the things that I kind of find interesting is that deficiencies are common in countries with strong fortification structures and policies. So the UK and the US, people have access to fortified foods. People have access to supplements, yet you still see these deficiencies. So it's not easy. I think people say, oh, it's so easy to consume an adequate diet. These are probably these are probably health conscious people like you and me who pay attention to everything they eat, right? And that's not the majority of people. So I think we have to think at the population level, what type of considerations should we think about?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point because one of the counter arguments is simply that, well, all we have to do is fortify more foods and eat fortified foods, and that'll take care of our deficiencies. So I guess the question is, are they simply not choosing the fortified foods, or is there something about the fortification process itself that still makes it inferior? So it may say there's X amount in this fortified foods, but because it's sort of, I don't know, unnatural, not just naturally occurring, but fortified, that it's actually only a percentage of that that's actually absorbed. So you know what I'm getting at? Is it just they're not choosing the fortified foods, or the fortification itself is sort of inadequate?
Yeah, and my organization Gain started primarily, in 2002, started primarily with the intent of improving fortification. So there are whole organizations devoted to this. We're much broader now. There's research topics devoted to this. It's not easy to fortify, so it's not easy from a logistics standpoint to get the right amount of fortified products, to monitor that, to make sure that the producers, whether they're large scale or whether they're small local producers in places, in developing countries, it's really not easy to ensure that the level of the product, the fortification in the product, is high enough or not too high, because you don't want to have some risk of overconsumption.
Right.
And you can't control a lot of times, like we can't control who is going to get the fortified foods. So you have to try to make it at the population level, and that's the challenge, right? Some people don't need fortified products, so if they consume them, they're getting excess. Some people need them more than others, but there's a real challenge to find a sweet spot to enforce it. And then you're right, people choosing the products, that's probably more of an issue in high income countries. There are fortified products, but if you're not choosing those products, or if they're not adequately fortified, then you're at risk for a deficiency.
Yeah, yeah, and then combine that with the chronic disease risk and the problem we have in our country of just eating too many calories, plain and simple. So, what number of calories do those nutrients come with? How many calories do you have to eat to get adequate nutrients? And I think it's pretty clear that a big sweet spot of the maximum nutrients for low number of calories, a lot of that comes from animal foods and not necessarily from fortified foods. But are there other examples or where you can get sort of the maximum nutrient for the minimum calories?
You mean outside of animal source foods? I think the key
Yeah.
category is dark green leafy vegetables. So,
Hmm.
kale, uh, spinach, those types of things. So they're very dense. Of course, it depends on the population. They're not as desirable for many people, right? You can't convince somebody to eat a pound of salad versus a pound of steak, right? It depends on the person. For some people, that's all. They're good with salad. Other people, they're not. So sort of an uphill battle in some ways. Soy is pretty nutrient dense.
Yeah.
Think about tofu, and soy milk has pretty high protein. So you think about like soy milk as a replacement for some people for cow milk. That's a reasonable option. But I think what I sort of want to emphasize is that their animal source foods and plant source foods are really complementary. You go too low in either, and you kind of you increase your risk of inadequacies.
Yeah, I like that message a lot about how they're complementary. And the other really important, very so important point that you just made was what are people's likes and dislikes and tastes. And food is an emotional thing for us. It's a part of our culture, it's part of our upbringing and our history, and part of our emotions and our enjoyment. So to assume that you can just dictate that everybody's going to eat less meat and be okay with that and eat plant foods that maybe they're not used to. I mean, it's one thing even here in the US where we're a melting pot, we all have different cultures, versus sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia or whatever the case may be, where it's totally different culture that in the foods you're going to try and do. So I think that's a part that's just completely missing in this message. And do you see that as being any part of the message now or in the future about the culturally appropriate diets, enjoyable diets, and factoring that into the equation as well?
Yeah, I think most researchers in my field of global nutrition, they do recognize that. But it's sort of a challenge to consider every barrier to healthy diets.
Hmm.
So there's
Yeah.
desirability, right? It's what you're talking about. There's the convenience, there's the affordability, and sort of the one of the things, like when you think about convenience, it's sort of how long does it take to prepare the food? Can you just open it up and eat it? Can you just pop it into the microwave or put it on stove, or do you have to chop a bunch of things, put it together? So those are all valid because, you think about people's time, you think about women's time in many countries, in low and middle income countries, their time is important. And so I think we do need to address the sort of convenience. We need to have things be affordable. But I don't think the solution is just buy a bunch of all packaged ultra processed foods because they're convenient. You can get your energy needs met. We know that that's not going to be a good solution for people health wise. And so I think it takes a lot of effort to consider all of these factors together. And if you look at it in a systematic way, you can, I think, have a better approach where you're considering all of these factors instead of just targeting one of them.
Yeah, yeah. But it's hard when the message is a reductionist message and a overly simplistic message. And that gets us into these rating systems, which, somebody in a prominent position puts out a food rating system, and it's thought to be true, right? It must be evidence-based. And so there's this food compass where, you were vocal about it on Twitter, which I thought was great. But some examples, ground beef was in the red zone of 26, meaning don't eat, basically. And cheese was at a 28, whereas Lucky Charms was a 60 in the yellow. Honey Nut Cheerios, full of sugar, was a green 76, and orange juice a green 78. Now, I mean, those examples to me are just mind-boggling. So what was going through your mind when you read this food ranking system, both in terms of its adequacy and maybe where it was coming from and the impact it was going to have on society making food choices?
Yeah. So I personally know a few of the authors, and I was aware of the project. I was aware that the paper is coming out. So when I saw it, I was excited to look at it. And I have to say that I quickly became disappointed because I think the effort from sort of a conceptual standpoint is kind of a nice idea, like combine all of these dietary factors, try to look at things, in this sophisticated way. And what for me, it was just very clear. If Honey Nut Cheerios is in the green and you have these other whole foods, like eggs scoring so low, it doesn't really seem to, for me, it doesn't seem to really represent the evidence that we have when you look at it holistically. Certain other things you didn't mention, an ice cream cone with nuts scores 34 in the yellow to be moderated, higher than like a whole egg fried in butter. So that to
Wow.
me, that indicates a problem in the algorithm. And so we decided, let's look into this. So we reviewed it very thoroughly. We went through every single step in the algorithm, every single metric, and we wrote a what's called a matters arising paper for the journal. We just submitted it yesterday, and so going to take a while for that to come out. We'll probably post a preprint on it so that people can kind of get access to that. But we're not trying to be overly critical, because these types of projects, these types of things are hard to do. But we want to raise the concern because I don't think it's going to have the positive impact that we need. I think there could be some positives, like it could increase, whole plant-rich foods, which I think is a good thing. But I think it's not the full story, and I think it has risk of really kind of encouraging or incentivizing ultra-processed foods. Many of the top-scoring foods are ultra-processed, and
Right.
just being ultra-processed, whatever your opinion is, I don't think it means it's necessarily bad. If you think about, there's some ultra-processed foods, you think about protein powder, I think that's very different than Lucky Charms, right? And so I think there needs to be more nuance to that. And I'm worried that, this is for taxation, this is for company ratings, this is for
Right.
investment decisions, this is for food labeling, warning signs. Are we going to see warning signs on whole foods that, the whole wheat bread, skinless chicken breast, these things score lower than the sugary breakfast cereals? And so it doesn't seem consistent with the evidence to me.
Yeah, yeah, that was a little crazy. And I reached out to Dr. Mazafarian. Unfortunately, he declined an invitation to come on the show. So I'm very curious, like when you looked at the algorithm, were you able to see like what you would estimate as their errors or what they made in the algorithm, like what they overly devalued and overly valued?
Yeah, so it's a number of things. For one, I don't think they properly um, valued nutrients, nutrient density, and sort of the nutrients that are greater public health concern. So if a food has some vitamin C versus some iron, it's going to get the same type of contribution when iron is a much bigger risk. I think a big factor is that the level of processing was a very minor factor in the score. It's less than 5%, so it's not really contributing much. And actually, there's actually an error in the way that they classify ultra processed foods. So it doesn't seem like it was done correctly for all of the foods. And also some of the foods that score, some of the foods that are ultra processed score 100. At least that they're labeled ultra processed, and you think, well, then the algorithm, even it says, if this is around 5% of the score, it should score less than 100, but it's not. So I think there's some inconsistencies there. I want to see the response from the authors. I hope that our letter is published. You never know, but I hope it's published, and I hope that they respond. And maybe some of this is some misunderstandings, but from looking at it, there are several points where I think the approach needs some adjustments if it's going to be really based in the evidence.
Yeah, and what about just the bias against animal foods? If you come in with an inherent bias against animal foods, you're gonna tailor your algorithm to fit that bias. And look, we shouldn't just pick on this one, right? There's the Nutri-Score in Europe, where I saw an example that Nesquik, the chocolate powder that you make chocolate milk with 16 grams of sugar, was ranked higher than ham, which had 5 grams of fat in it. So it's not that it's just this one score. It seems like it's sort of pervasive, and it seems like I don't know, from my standpoint, there's this underlying bias against animal foods that's put in throughout all this. Do you think that plays a big role?
Yeah, I think there is a bias, and for people who work in the U.S. or other high-income countries like Australia or the U.K., where some of these systems have been developed or applied, it's probably the bias against animal source foods has less harmful impact because people are already consuming decent amounts, and they're probably not going to necessarily reduce it just because of this label or something. Where I think the bias is there. Where I see the big concern is when people like to apply these systems globally. And that's actually, you can see that that's an intent for Food Compass and others, where they're really hinting at taking this for global application. And what I'd be concerned with is you don't want to be penalizing these nutrient-dense animal source foods, especially in low and middle income countries where malnutrition is high, undernutrition is high.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's the scariest part. I mean, it's one thing to say, look at this, it doesn't mean anything, I'm not going to pay attention to it, forget about it. But it's another thing to say, well, who is going to pay attention to it? Who's going to use this? And what are the downstream implications? And that's the really scary part. So that's why it's so great to have someone like you coming from an evidence-based standpoint about nutrient deficiencies, about the difference between animal and plant source foods, about ultra-processed foods, and giving a different perspective. It just needs to be a louder voice. So what are ways that we can get this message out there even more? Like, what do you recommend people can do?
Yeah, I think we my colleagues and I have written this letter, and there's a couple others I think we've also kind of written about. I don't know how to make it amplified. I think that it's probably important to share with people who are policymakers, to share with other researchers, and then the general public. I get a little concerned about the polarization it generates on the social media channels. So I can post something and then people can take it out of context and say, this is like the researchers have no idea what they're doing, and they're all corrupt. And I feel like that's not true. I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. So as much as we can get the message out there that, look, let's not attack the people, let's not dehumanize anybody, and let's focus on the issues and the evidence in a constructive way. That's how I would want people to criticize my work. I want to be criticized, I want to be held accountable for things, but I want it to be done in a constructive way. So let's try to do that for everybody, and say, look, we appreciate what you have to offer. We appreciate this effort. These are concerns, and let's work towards addressing them as a community.
Yeah, that is a wonderful comment right there. And So true about social media and about the reaction that people can get. And that's why I highly recommend people follow you on Twitter, because you are one of those voices that really wants to get to the root of the problem and not worry about the personalities, not worrying about the extreme reactions, but let's boil it down to what is the problem and how can we address it and how can we be more clear about the message, which I think is so important and undervalued. So
Thank you.
I do hear though that things are changing from GAIN and that you're moving on. And so what are future projects that you want to get more involved in to try and help this space along and help this message?
Yeah, that's true. I'm going to be heading over your way to California. I'll be in Los Angeles probably starting June. So I'm going to be a research affiliate at UC Santa Barbara, and probably starting to do some new projects and potentially stay on with some existing ones. So I currently work on a project called the Food Systems Dashboard that looks to take all types of food systems data, anything from the health indicators, what people eat, the environmental issues, and combine it all into one place. We have a lot of plans to expand that work to make it more detailed in terms of how granular we're getting with the data, looking at subgroups, looking subnationally within countries about how that varies, and trying to help say how can we use this data to inform policy and really make changes that can improve people's lives and preserve the environment. Other projects I'm looking into, actually one, I'm really proud of GAIN and their sort of strategy to be nuanced in these perspectives. They've never discouraged me from sort of putting out research that can be controversial. If I'm putting out something that's advocating for a moderate amount of animal source foods from both the health and environmental perspective, that can be criticized from some people. But
Yeah.
GAIN has we actually have a program in development where we're seeking to sustainably increase consumption of animal source foods, and so that's sort of a bold move right there. Like we're going into a country where intake is very low in a context where it's not consumed much. We want to increase it for nutrition reasons, but we want to
Mhm.
make sure it's done sustainably. And I think there are real concerns about issues with all foods, of course, but certainly animal source foods. What people don't really realize is it's not just about the change in intake from a very low intake to a moderate intake, it's the population growth. Actually, a large part of the increase in foods and in animal source food consumption in Africa is going to be just from population growth.
Right.
So it's going to be an issue regardless of what people's perspective is in terms of how much people should be consuming or whatnot. It's going to be an issue. So I think what we're trying to do is head that on. So I hope to be involved in projects like that going forward. And for me, just trying to look holistically at diets. How can we make diets that are healthy for people and the planet? And how can we do it in a way that's equitable, that doesn't take away people's freedoms and choice, and really respects all of the stakeholders involved? So hopefully I can continue that type of work going forward.
Yeah, it's such an important message. I mean, so if anybody is working on projects where they need someone like you, they better come and scoop you up before someone else does, because your message is, look, you're not a plant guy, you're not an animal guy, you're a diet adequacy guy. You're a guy to make sure it's the same in the U.S. as it is in lower income countries. You want equality of diets, equality of nutrients, and so that we all have access to it. And I think that's so important. Rather than being in one specific camp, you're in the camp for nutrients, which is a breath of fresh air and what we need. So thank you for all the work you have been doing and have done and will continue to do. And thanks for joining me today on the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Brett. Really appreciate it, and I've enjoyed the discussion. So let's stay in touch and keep talking going forward.
For sure.